First, we plant the metal seed, and then in no time we shall have a metal tree.
What's wrong with you?
Hello friendos, this is Chain, welcoming you back to Chain of Commander, and it is time for our monthly visit to the base of operations, where we talk about ways that we can make your mana base work harder for you. And with Modern Horizons 2 just around the corner, I could not think of a better time than any to finally dig into these artifact lands. With Modern Horizons 2 introducing 11 new ones for us to play with, seemed like it was a good time. Now, before we get into it, I do ask if any of these cards seem like something you would personally want to play with. Definitely consider using that TCG Player affiliate link in the description below. It won't cost you a single cent more, but it will help out the channel. That said, without further ado, let's just hop into these artifact lands. So what are these artifact lands we have at our disposal? Well, as mentioned earlier, Modern Horizons 2 introduced 11 new ones. But as far as the original artifact lands are concerned, we have the 5 monocolored ones that were introduced in Mirrodin. That would be Ancient Den for white, Seat of the Synod for blue, Vault of Whispers for black, Great Furnace for red, and Tree of Tales for green. Then in Darksteel, they gave us Darksteel Citadel, which produced colorless mana, but was indestructible. Flash forward to, well, now, when Modern Horizons 2 is coming out, and there are 11 more for us to play with. First, there are the new bridges, the whole cycle of bridges. These are 10, one of each colored pairing, enter the battlefield tap lands that are, like Darksteel Citadel, indestructible. It also included a spicy little number in Power Depot. This is another enter the battlefield tap land, but it doesn't produce any colored mana. Small correction to this, it can produce colored mana, but only to cast or activate the abilities of artifacts. Only produce colorless, but it does have modular 1, which means it does enter with a +1/+1 counter on it, and if at any point it goes from the battlefield into the graveyard, you can then take that +1/+1 counter and put it on any other artifact creature you control. Beyond that, we do have 6 more lands that, at their natural state, are not artifacts, but they are creature lands that when they are turned into creatures become artifact creatures. And those we have Blinkmoth Nexus, Ink Moth Nexus, Dread Statuary, Frostwalk Bastion, Mishra's Factory, and Stalking Stones. The last of which there, the Stalking Stones, is the only one to permanently become an artifact creature once you pay its activation cost. The rest only do so until end of turn. So what are some of the reasons you want to be playing these artifact lands? Well, the first of which is that there are several mechanics out there that give you more bang for your buck for the more artifacts that you play. Metalcraft, for example. This is a mechanic that says if you have 3 or more artifacts under your control, you get some amount of bonus from a card that you have. Let's look at Dispatch. This is a single white to tap target creature at instant speed. However, if you have Metalcraft, it exiles that creature instead, becoming a better path to exile. So, definitely a huge step up in power just for having 3 or more artifacts. Likewise, Mox Opal, this is a mana rock that does not even function unless you have 3 artifacts under your control. Luckily, it does count to itself, so it makes it a little bit easier to get to, but still, if you don't have those 2 other artifacts, it is borderline useless. The next mechanic is affinity for artifacts. Affinity comes in a couple different flavors, where affinity for X means for how many X permanents that you control of that type, the spell is cheaper. For example, the new Thought Monitor, also coming out of Modern Horizons 2, is 6 and a blue for a 2/2 flyer that when it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards. So, since it has affinity for artifacts, if you control 6 other artifacts when you go to cast this, this costs you a single blue mana to draw 2 cards and get a 2/2 flyer, and that is an insanely good rate. In fact, this is the exact interaction which led to the original 6 artifact lands from being banned in Standard, as well as the 5 color-producing artifact lands for being banned in Modern. These are very powerful interactions that we still get to play in our format. So what kind of led to this particular situation where these cards have been banned? Well, normally over the course of the game, you're going to be casting your artifacts over the turn. But now because an artifact exists in your land slot, you could get potentially twice the amount of artifacts per turn, very quickly getting to the 3 artifacts you need for Metalcraft, or being able to cast large affinity spells for relatively cheap. And the cool thing about the artifact lands when it comes to affinity is not only does it provide the discount, it can also be tapped for mana to pay for whatever affinity reduction does not cover. Oh, but it's not just about making our spells more powerful with Metalcraft or making our spells cheaper with affinity, though those are by themselves still pretty solid. We have ways to just completely cheat on mana cost with artifacts. There are several spells out there that allow us to sacrifice artifacts to get other artifacts onto the battlefield. So, Arkham Dagsum allows you to sacrifice an artifact you control to put a non-creature artifact from your library onto the battlefield. Reshape. This allows you to play X blue and sacrifice an artifact to get an artifact mana value extra less out of your library onto the battlefield. Reshape is essentially the fixed version of Tinker, which would normally just let you pay a flat rate of 3, but Tinker is indeed banned in our format because it is mighty powerful. But it's not just about getting things out of your library. No, there are even more cards out there that allow us to get artifacts back from our graveyard. So things like Duretti, Scrap Savant, Goblin Welder, Goblin Engineer, Trash for Treasure. All of these allow us to sacrifice an artifact to bring back any other artifact from the graveyard. And in order to get the best value out of these spells, you need to be sacrificing a very small artifact for a very big artifact. So, let's say you have some lands, one of which is an artifact land. Let's say you have something like Wormcoil Engine or Phyrexian Triniform in the graveyard, some big, powerful hit. You can then use these cards, sacrifice the land, to get this very more impactful artifact creature back from the graveyard. This works incredibly well after board wipes as well, where your entire board may be cleared of other artifacts to sack. However, in the graveyard, or not in the graveyard, in your mana base, you have some artifacts hidden that you can use to still bring things back. Now, before we go any further, if you've been enjoying this segment so far, definitely consider hitting that like button in the bottom corner to show your appreciation. I know I would appreciate it greatly. And that said, let's keep rolling here. One of my favorite things about artifact lands is how we can take advantage of some very specific cards to get some very powerful and consistent ramp throughout the game. Previously mentioned, you can sacrifice an artifact to bring back another artifact with Duretti and the friends. So you could theoretically be sacking a artifact of non-landness and getting an artifact land back from the graveyard if you so choose. But we have 2 tools at our disposal that can really start pumping out lands for us, and that is Mechanized Production and Prototype Portal. Assuming you have enchanted an artifact land with Mechanized Production, and assuming you have imprinted an artifact land on Prototype Portal, these both will be producing extra lands for you every turn. Mechanized Production at your upkeep, and Prototype Portal whenever you activate it. This results in essentially doubling up on your land drops each turn in such a way that you can get ramped and you can start powering very far ahead just within a couple turns. And these are very accessible combos in these decks. Prototype Portal doesn't even require a color in your deck to be able to run this combo. Mechanized Production does require you to have blue, but only blue at your disposal to run. And the cool thing about the Mechanized Production one as well is that it has the potential to just win the game for you. When you have 8 or more artifacts with the same name under your control at your upkeep, you just win the game. So if you get Mechanized Production on one of the indestructible lands, whether it be Darksteel Citadel or one of the bridges, to the point where you're producing an extra one of those lands every turn, that is a very difficult way to interact for your opponents to stop the Mechanized Production from potentially just accidentally winning for you over the course of 8 turns. Alright, one last benefit of these artifact lands I want to go over for today is how nicely they play with anything that triggers when an artifact enters the battlefield under your control. As of right now, there are 14 creatures that trigger when artifacts enter the battlefield under your control. That's less than I thought there would be, but hey, the research don't lie. The most common of which that most people are familiar with is Reckless Fireweaver, which recently came out of the Kaladesh block that deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control. Normally, it'll just be seeing the artifacts that you're casting over the course of the game. However, as soon as you have artifact lands in your land slot, occupying a land drop for the turn, you get some incidental triggers off of them. You get maybe an extra trigger every turn or so just from playing your lands. So Reckless Fireweaver suddenly doing extra 2 to 3 damage over the course of a couple turn cycles, and over time that really does add up. But there's also one last interaction I want to go over with today. It didn't get its own category because it's not really all that great, but I owe this interaction a mention because this is one of the interactions that really hooked me into Magic when I first started playing. And that is Ensoul Artifact and Darksteel Citadel. And you can even do this with the new bridges as well. But with Ensoul Artifact, costing 1 and a blue, you can have a 5/5 indestructible creature as early as turn 2 just from hitting regular land drops without any other form of acceleration. Now, in our format, is a 5/5 indestructible on turn 2 all that great? No. In fact, it's probably a bit too slow. But back when I was first starting and playing Standard, a 5/5 indestructible on turn 2 was a pretty fast start. So I owed it to this interaction to bring it up. It's a lot of fun, if albeit probably not as good in our format as in others. Now, before we go any further, if you folks have been really enjoying this, if you've already hit that like button, definitely consider subscribing as well. I'd love to have you folks join us going forward when we talk about stuff like this. We like to talk about ways to make your decks better. We like to talk about decks to build, and we like to just talk about general chit-chat of the Commander format. So I'd love to have you folks hang out with us going forward. But one last thing to cover, and then we can call it a wrap for the day. Alright, the last thing I really want to talk about here is pretty much the big disclaimer that goes along with playing these artifact lands, because they are by no means just strict upgrades from regular lands and basic lands that you could be playing. There are some situations and cards out there that can really put a hamper on your game plan just by having artifacts in your mana base. Things like Stony Silence, which says artifacts cannot have their abilities activated. Turns off all of your artifact lands from being able to produce mana, being able to tap to produce mana. Karn, Great Creator. This is a planeswalker with a static ability that says that your opponents cannot activate the abilities of artifacts. So if this is on one of your opponent's side of the field, once again, all your artifact lands are turned off from making mana. But even if they're just turned off, they're still there. But then there's things like Vandal Blast, Shatterstorm, Cleansing Nova, Austere Command. All of these can just destroy all artifacts at once, which would destroy any artifact land you control that is not indestructible. So the new bridges and Darksteel Citadel would be able to get around this. However, things like Merciless Eviction, Consulate Crackdown, things that exile the artifacts instead, will hit all of them. This could be a situation where if you have several of these artifact lands on the battlefield and somebody goes ahead and casts a Vandal Blast or a Merciless Eviction, you can now be set back a large chunk of mana, and that can be a pretty big hit late in the game. So definitely be wary. Don't just go auto-including these things into every deck. Be mindful about where you put these lands. This is why we have segments like this, so we can weigh the pros and the cons of specific land types of being put in your deck. At this point, I want to hear from you folks. I want to know which decks you're planning on playing these new artifact lands in, which decks you are currently playing the existing artifact lands in, and just see what sort of decks you guys are playing with them. I'd love to hear what you guys are working with. Definitely let me know in the comments below. Beyond that, thank you all very much for joining me today. I'll see you guys again in the future.